Hello everybody, welcome back to Allan Walls Photography. This is Alan, and today is part 2 of our lighting series where we talk about natural light. Before we get started, a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters and the people who have made donations through my website. I desperately need the help, and I couldn't do this without your help, so thank you so very much. If you have not subscribed to this channel, do so, please, and ring the bell thing under there as well, so you'll be notified when new videos are released. Now, this video was initially planned to be one video, but as I started producing the video, I realized there was no way I could get all of the information I wanted to share with you into one video. So part 2 consists of 3 subparts. I'm only telling you this because my shirt is going to keep changing color. The original video was with a blue shirt and it's in the laundry and I didn't have time to wash it. You don't care about that, do you? No, you don't. Okay, fair enough. In section 1 of part 2 for natural light, I'm going to be talking about the sun, about sunlight, about how our senses react to light, the brightness of light, how we measure it, dynamic range, what that means, how it can fool our cameras, and what we can do to work with dynamic range that exceeds the abilities of our cameras. That's in this section. There are 2 other sections after this one. I'm going to go change my shirt and we will get started. How important is lighting as a component of outdoor photography? Well, I suppose that depends. It depends on what you're photographing, what your subject is. There are certainly photographs that would have such a compelling subject that the light would be pretty much beside the point. Say, for example, you happen to be in the right place in the right time to photograph the first batch of aliens marching off the flying saucer that just landed, and you were shooting off picture after picture, but you forgot to adjust your white balance, and there was a pinkish hue to the gray antennas. I think you'll still go viral, and I think you'll still get a lot of likes and probably a contract or something from that photograph, and you never even thought about the light. On the other extreme, many of the photographs that I go back to over and over again are photographs in which the light is really more important than the subject. This is not an example of one of those photographs. This is one of my photographs. I just happen to like it, and I like it because of the light. And in that case, of course, light becomes incredibly important. So a better answer to the question might be that lighting is really always important. If nothing else, using the light to the maximum advantage can only improve a photograph. It can be a great photograph and you haven't paid attention to the light, but it will be a better one if you have. So, in my opinion, we can't really meaningfully discuss any of the other kinds of light we're going to be discussing in this series if we don't take a good look at natural light and understand what it is and why it affects our photographs in the way it does. Let's talk for just a second about where the light comes from. The sun is a gigantic 750,000 mile wide nuclear fusion reactor in the middle of space. About 4.5 billion years ago, there was a big cloud of molecules, mostly hydrogen, towards the edge of the Orion spiral in the Milky Way galaxy. As happens with clouds of molecules, they come together close enough to form a gravitational field. ultimately, there was so much mass, this big cloud of molecules collapsed under its own weight. It's called a gravitational collapse. So as the pressure in the middle of this ball of hydrogen condensed further and further, and the pressure and the temperature got higher and higher, eventually there was enough energy in the core of the sun to start fusing atoms of hydrogen into helium, and in the process gives off an enormous amount of energy. And that reaction is going on continuously in the heart of the sun. How much hydrogen is converted? It's 600 million tons of hydrogen every second. In the process of that 600 million tons of hydrogen producing helium, a total of 4 million tons of matter is converted into energy. And that energy takes somewhere between 10,000 and 170,000 years to get from the core of the sun to its surface. It's radiated away from the sun out into space in wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that fall between infrared and ultraviolet, with some of both of those wavelengths on either side. But it covers the entire spectrum of visible light. That's what our sun is spewing out as a byproduct of all of those fusion reactions. Our job as photographers is to figure out how to use that river of energy coming from the sun to take pictures. It seems rather trivial in that context, doesn't it? There are a couple of different ways that people approach the use of natural light in their photography. I like to think of the two groups. They overlap, of course, but the two groups are the subject-oriented group and the light-oriented group. The subject-oriented group will select their subject. They'll have their subject in mind. They know exactly what they want to photograph, and they know exactly what they want it to look like. So what they'll do is patiently wait for the light conditions to be the way they want them. Then they go out and they take their photograph. Most of us probably fall in the other group, where we go out with a camera and we observe the conditions. We assess the light that's available, and then we go looking for things that will fit with that light, things that will look good in that light. Either way is fine, but both ways require you understand light. And that's my point here, is it doesn't really matter whether you consider light to be the most important factor or a relatively unimportant factor. To get the best out of your camera, to become the best photographer you can, you have to understand the light that you're working with. There are a couple of things about natural light that set it aside from all the other kinds of light we're going to be talking about. One of those is that natural light doesn't really care about us or what we're doing. It is what it is. We have to adapt to work with it. Whereas all the other lights we're talking about, we change them. We can manipulate them, change their position, change their intensity, change their color. We can do all that ourselves. Not so with natural light. Though we can make a few changes for the purposes of this discussion, we're at the sun's mercy. The other thing about natural light as a source of light for photography is that it is never static. It is always in a state of flux. Once we set up our speed lights in a nice dark room and have our specimen positioned and we start shooting, the only thing that's going to change our light source is when we accidentally nudge a speed light or a battery runs out. But for the natural light that we find when we go out into nature, it is constantly changing. The sun is getting brighter and then it's getting dimmer. It's going from having a blue cast to an orange cast to a clear white, back through orange to blue. As the source of light moves across the sky, the way it interacts with three-dimensional objects on the surface of the earth changes dramatically and continuously. Shadows, for example, which can be long and soft and hidden in a very narrow dynamic range very early in the morning, can become stark and painful to look at and highly contrasted at noon, before the shadows again begin to lengthen towards the end of the day. It's that never-ending, ever-changing character of light that makes natural light photography so challenging and so rewarding. I think the single most important attribute a natural light photographer can develop is the ability to immediately and almost unconsciously reassess the lighting. It's only when you have that unconscious ability to reappraise the sun from moment to moment that you develop the skills necessary to anticipate what's going to happen next. And that is so important. So what are the characteristics of light, and how do we talk about light in such a way that I could describe to you the light at a particular moment in time, even if you weren't there? Well, we describe light in terms of its intensity or luminance. We describe it in terms of its color or color temperature, as we talked about last time. And we describe it in terms of its direction. But let's look at all three of these things separately first. Let's start by talking about brightness. A quick word about scale, because it's pretty important. The range of light intensities that we can perceive with our eyes goes all the way from the minimal amount of light that we can perceive, which is about 1/1000th of 1 candela per square meter. Whereas the sun has a brightness of about 100,000 candelas per square meter. That is just a ginormous range of values. And if we describe them by their actual numbers of candelas per square meter, it's not really very helpful. So what we use is called a base 2 logarithmic scale. So when I go from an exposure value, or a stop as we call it in photography, of say 4 to 5, without having to even discuss the actual candelas per meter squared that are involved, we could calculate it, but instead of doing that, all we need to know is that as you go from 4 stops to 5 stops, you've doubled the light intensity. That's what a stop is. It's a doubling. That is what a logarithmic base 2 scale is. By the way, a logarithmic base 10 scale that you're very familiar with is the decibel that we use for sound. Sound also has a massive range of values over which the actual sound can be measured. So we use decibels instead. So by far the most important take-home nugget from this part of what we're talking about is that when we describe an increase of 1 stop of light, whether that is from an exposure value of 1 to 2, or an exposure value of 29 to 30, we are talking about a doubling or a halving, depending on which direction you're going in. So if you have an exposure value of 4 and you go to 5, that's twice as much light. If you go from 4 to 3, that's half as much light. And that allows us to compress this massive scale of light intensities down into something very much more manageable, the doublings and the halvings. So most cameras we're likely to see have a dynamic range of about 9 to 13 exposure values, depending on the brand and the model. Some of the really high-end cameras, actually like the D850 I'm recording this on, has a total dynamic range of about close to 15 stops, which is a tremendous amount of light when you consider that's 15 doublings. That's a broad range. You've probably heard people talk about how the dynamic range of a camera is just a fraction of the dynamic range of the human eye. And that's just not true, not if we're comparing apples and apples. And let me explain why. It is true that the human eye can perceive 1/1000th of a candela per meter squared of light intensity because we can see in starlight without a moon. We can't see much and we can't see it very clearly, but we can sense that amount of light. Similarly, we can sense 100,000 candelas per square meter from direct sunlight on a cloudless day, but we can't do them both at the same time. In order for us to be able to see the light at these two intensities, our eye would have to change radically. Our pupil would have to close to a pinpoint on this end, and it would have to open up to the size of a dinner plate on this end. Even the cells in our retina, the rod cells and the cone cells, would have to change the way they function in order for us to see the very bright and the very dim. At the very bright end, most of the sensing will be done by our cones. But as we get all the way to this very, very dim light, we'd need specially adapted rod cells to see it. And my point is this: if we constrain our eyes to the instant, say, of a shutter release, meaning we don't allow any time for adaptation of our eyes or accommodation of our eyes, and we measure how much light we can actually see in a single scene, comparing it to a camera, they're the same, pretty much. About 14 would be what you would expect, 14 stops of light intensity. And that brings it pretty close to what we're talking about with a camera. So don't fall for that particular one. It's just not true. So let's talk about this dynamic range in terms of the sensor of the camera, seeing as that's what really matters here. The sensor of the camera is covered in what are called photosites. Photosites aren't the same thing as pixels or sensors. There are actually 3 pixels in a stack forming what's called a photosite. It makes more sense to talk about photosites than it does individual pixels. So when that photon strikes the photosite, it results in an analog signal being sent to the analog digital converter in your camera, which spits out a digital representation of the energy that just hit that photosite. That's the least amount of light that your sensor can record. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's take these photosites and fill them with photons. Let the photons just keep pouring in. Once one of these photosites is filled up, or saturated as we call it, no additional photons have any effect. They don't get into the photosite because the photosite's full and they bounce off. That is what defines the dynamic range of your camera's sensor. You have a minimum amount of light that will result in a minimum digital signal. On the other end, you have a maximum amount of photons, above which no further stimulation will result in a different signal. So that defines the range that we call dynamic range. So in order to increase the dynamic range of your camera, The only thing that you can really do is make the photo sites bigger. Because if the photo sites are bigger and they can hold more absolute numbers of photons, then the upper limit of the dynamic range would increase and you would have a broader dynamic range. It seems to me that making our cameras more sensitive to the very, very bright tones and adding a couple more stops of white will have limited use in actual practical walking around photography. What do you do when the dynamic range of your scene falls outside of the dynamic range of your sensor? Well, there are a couple of tricks for either compressing the dynamic range of the scene that you're looking at or using your camera's exposure mechanics to capture the detail that would otherwise be cut off. The first of those involves using neutral density filters. Let's say, for example, you're taking a photograph outdoors at noon on a bright day. The only thing that's bumping your dynamic range and causing you to clip in the highlights is the sky. The sky is too bright, in other words. What you can do is to use what's called a graduated neutral density filter, which is a piece of glass, or the cheap ones are plastic, where only about 1/2 of the surface is actually shaded, which is actually going to block the light. These filters are most commonly square or rectangular in shape, and they fit in a holder that fits to the front of your lens, and you can drop the filter in such a way that the darker part of the filter covers the sky and the horizon roughly corresponds to the transition zone, either a sharp line or a gentle graduation. And what you can do, depending on the particular filter you're using, you can drop the intensity of the sky by a stop or 2 or 3 stops. If the difference is only tiny, if you're only clipping just a little bit in the highlights, you could also use a polarizing filter. That will sometimes knock off just enough intensity for you to capture the full dynamic range of the scene. The way that regular neutral density filters are used is to decrease the amount of light entering the camera so that we can use a longer shutter speed if we want to for creative purposes. For example, if we wanted to catch moving water as a silky, otherworldly surface, and we need to use a 30-second exposure, but it's bright sunshine, we'll put a very, very dark neutral density filter on the lens, allowing us to do both. The second technique for me is absolutely indispensable, and I almost do it now automatically without thinking about it. And that is I shoot using exposure bracketing. Shooting a bracketed set of images simply means you're going to take 3 photographs or 5 photographs very close together of the exact same scene, but between each shot you're going to raise or lower your shutter speed. So say you did this with 3 photographs, you'll have one photograph where the sky looks absolutely perfect, but everything else is underexposed. Then you'll have one that's kind of in the middle, and then you'll have a third one where your landscape is perfectly exposed, but the sky is just pure white, overexposed. And what you do is you combine those photographs in your editing program, whatever that might be. Lightroom, Photoshop, all are capable of doing this. And the program will allow you to keep those parts that are not clipped. So you end up with the good sky and the good foreground. One consideration when you're doing exposure bracketing is how far apart your bracketed shots need to be. That largely depends on how far out of the scene's dynamic range you are. The further the scene's dynamic range exceeds your camera's dynamic range, the bigger the steps will want to be. A good rule of thumb, I have my camera set up to where there are 3 clicks separating a single stop of exposure. So what I will usually do is, when I've set up my scene and it's exactly the way I want it, I'll decrease the shutter speed by 3 clicks, which is a stop, take a photograph, increase by 3, take a photograph, increase by 3, take a photograph. Then I will have 3 images as close together in time as possible that are separated by a total of 2 stops. There are other ways that you can do it. You can use the camera's automatic function if it has it. One of the problems of doing this, of course, is that some elements in your scene may move between the shots, which is an argument for using the camera's automatic function, because it'll take those pictures really quickly. It'll make those changes very rapidly. Don't change the lighting. Don't do exposure bracketing by changing your aperture or anything like that, because you'll also change the depth of field and change the photograph in other ways. And shoot them all at the same ISO. Even though the displays on our cameras now are really fantastic and they give you a very good look at the image, and even though our histograms are very sophisticated, it's really, really hard if you're working with a scene with high dynamic range to be absolutely sure that you got the exposure right. Remember that while there is a definite range, a dynamic range that the camera can operate in, that range can be moved with the camera settings. So if your scene dynamic range is this big and your camera's is exactly the same, you cannot be off on your exposure. From a technical standpoint, it's really important whether you are using bracketing or not, but especially if not, that you expose for the highlights. By that I mean, make sure you get the exposure right in the brightest parts of the scene. The reason, you do not want to clip in the highlights. Clipped highlights are pure white. They look terrible in a photograph. No matter how small they are, they just always look bad. Whereas clipped shadows don't look as bad. I still don't like them, and I still want to get it perfect, so I'll usually bracket around all of that. But yeah, expose for the highlights. And if you're going to sacrifice any part of the exposure, sacrifice by clipping down in the shadows. I cannot overemphasize the importance of using your histogram when you shoot. In fact, if there was anything that you were not going to look at, it would be the photograph. You are going to get more useful information about exposure by examining the histogram carefully after your shot than you will by looking at the picture itself, which is distracting. There's another characteristic of light's brightness that is important to remember. When we talk about luminance, we're talking about the brightness of the scene. That means the brightness of the light as well as the brightness of the things the light is hitting. In contrast, when we talk about illuminance, ILL luminance, we're talking about the incident light only. That is, the light that is falling on our subject. The most common place you're going to run into getting confused by the difference between luminance and illuminance is if you're using a light meter. A lot of people assume that the light meter that your camera has in it performs the same function as a handheld light meter, but it does not. The camera itself is recording the reflected light intensity, and that's what it's reading out to you. It's not actually telling you anything about the intensity of the light that is hitting your subject, only that portion that's being reflected. And if you're planning on adding additional light, if you're planning on adding a fill light, say, we haven't talked about mixing natural light with flash, but I may leave that until we talk about flash. But it's useful to know exactly how much light is falling on your subject, because there are ways that your camera can get tricked by contrast. When I said earlier that a single photon dinging one of your photo sites will determine the lowest point of your dynamic range, that's where the analogy kind of breaks down, because the low point of your dynamic range is determined by the point at which the electronics in your camera start substituting real detail with noise, meaning it can no longer find detail in the dark areas, and instead noise is created in that area. That's really the low point of your dynamic range, which means, of course, as cameras become more and more sophisticated and the ISO is able to operate noiselessly over a far greater range, that also increases the dynamic range of the camera. So how do the conditions that we find the light in affect the dynamic range of our scene? That's a useful thing to know. On a cloudy, overcast morning, you very probably are operating with a scene dynamic range of about 3 stops. But on a bright sunny day with no clouds at noon, you're probably up to 13 stops. So clearly, as the quality of the light changes in terms of its brightness and its position, your dynamic range is going to increase, and it will tax your camera to be able to capture everything. It's another reason I think that we photographers like to take pictures early in the day and late in the afternoon. That's it for section 1. I think that's more than enough. In section 2, we're going to be looking at the direction and color of natural light, and we'll also get into some thoughts about how we can modify natural light. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. The next video should be out in just a day or 2, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks again for watching. Take care, be safe.